Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Tyrone back with Tech Life. And since this is the final day of 2020, I wanted to go ahead and make the video that I've made every year, which is the coverage comparison and to see who still has the most and best coverage at the end of 2020. So, again, there aren't many or a lot of crowdsourced maps out there. We used to be able to compare against Sensorly. They have shut down, I think this year, at the beginning of this year, if I remember correctly, they shut down the site completely. So they no longer were taking any data points, and now you can't even access that map anymore. I think there's a couple of other ones out there, but they're far smaller in size. So the best that I've found, and many others, the best app and map to reference is really RootMetrics and their crowdsourced maps. And they have gotten updates over the years, the maps, and coverage has grown over the years for all carriers. So still, for now, for the time being in 2020, according to the crowdsourced data points, Verizon has the largest network in the United States. And you can see here, of course, it does change a bit once you zoom in. But if you look at the overall footprint, if you look at the eastern side and the western side, how deep and dark and dense the colors are, you can see that they have the most coverage in the United States. Now, is it the best performing coverage? That's very debatable. Because like I mentioned in other videos, there's still a lot of band 13 only sites, a lot of 2x2 MIMO sites that are just not performing as great as what AT&T's network has done recently in terms of speed that we've seen. So when as AT&T has been expanding with FirstNet and implementing the one-touch strategy, they've gone back to their cell sites and they've upgraded to the newest panels, 4x4 MIMO, 256 QAM, and they've added all LTE carriers to a lot of these sites. So they've picked up in the performance metrics tremendously in speed on a more larger scale, but the crowdsourced still shows them being the smaller network for now. That is going to change very, very soon, as AT&T has rapidly been expanding the FirstNet coverage. So what I've been anticipating is happening is that AT&T is expanding the network far faster than the crowdsourced map can actually pick up. So if they've expanded the network at a very large pace in Nebraska, but who's really traveling that stretch specifically that's going to map this on the RootMetrics map? So that's kind of where I was going with that. It's going to take a while for the crowdsourced maps to pick up on AT&T's expansion, because it's happening at scale, massively at scale, and so fast that the crowdsourced data points may not pick it up right away. So again, this is the Verizon one. It still shows them, according to the crowdsourced, again, being the largest carrier at a roughly estimated 64,000 macro sites nationwide. Now, again, as I mentioned in the other video, they took a balanced approach. They knew they needed density, which they are filling in now using the small cells and macros. But back then, when they first built their LTE network, they took a more coverage approach with low band, spaced for low band. And then at the later parts of towards the end of the LTE era in 2015, 16, 17, they really started incorporating the densification that we now see on Verizon's network. So that's kind of how Verizon got to where they're at today. So next, we got the AT&T map. Now, as you can see, on the eastern side of the country, the East Coast, you could say it's comparable to Verizon. There might be some spots where you need more of that coloring, more densely, but it looks like AT&T might have virtually caught Verizon on the eastern. Now, where it gets a little bit lesser is on the western side of the country, like towards the mountains. You can see that there's still a lot more orange, not as much color filled in on the crowdsourced maps. So that is hinting towards, AT&T lacking on the western side. Now, again, as I just mentioned, I don't know if the crowdsourced maps are able to pick up the expansion as fast as AT&T is expanding, but we will, of course, keep track of that in 21 to see if there are any major changes by the end of 21. So how did AT&T really achieve this type of coverage expansion at that scale, and how fast? So early on in 2012, 13, 14, AT&T was also behind on LTE. They were largely betting on HSPA, just like T-Mobile was. Sprint was largely betting on WiMAX, and Verizon has already gone to LTE at that point. So AT&T has been trying to catch up on LTE, just like T-Mobile. Now, they had more money to spend at that time, so they largely caught up pretty quickly. But then it ended up only being 2 carriers of LTE in a lot of markets. They weren't up to speed, and the coverage lacked quite a bit back then. There was a lot of HSPA for AT&T still out there, a lot of T1 backhaul. And then in 14, 15, 16, it kind of just, AT&T just wasn't exciting anymore. It came to a complete halt. They weren't really expanding the coverage outside of their footprint. A lot of the coverage was HSPA, to where it got to a point where if you were into the industry, you were tracking it, T-Mobile was about to catch AT&T's footprint. That's how bad it got. I had people send me screenshots of them traveling, and T-Mobile was on LTE on that stretch, and AT&T was on HSPA. That's how bad it had gotten. And then come 2017, FirstNet contract, it all changed. It all changed. It did a 360. It did a complete 360. And then we started getting the reimbursement. Well, AT&T started getting the reimbursement for hitting milestones from the government. And then, they got the additional band 14 spectrum, and the rest is history. They've been expanding about roughly 3,100 to 3,300 cell sites per year since 2017. Most of those cell sites were geared for coverage. They're gaining insane amounts of square miles every year now. They have arguably now the best LTE product out in the wild across the board. Not the largest coverage yet, but wherever you're traveling to and they have coverage, it is 9 times out of 10 going to be faster than what you're seeing on Verizon and or T-Mobile. Literally. Even in the more rural parts where T-Mobile likely doesn't exist yet, and it's kind of back and forth with Verizon, you are likely able to get faster, better performance on AT&T. That's a safe bet now in 2020. And that'll only get better in 2021. They're starting to add C-RAN hubs in the mountains. So that means small cells are going to come to fill in the coverage gaps for AT&T. Verizon has done that as well in the past. So AT&T is going to, that picture that you see here of their coverage, it's going to be far larger in definitely next year. They're growing at a pace that I predict, again, the coverage crowdsourced maps just can't keep up with. And it'll be a while before those data points can be tracked. So that's kind of, and they have a decent sized 5G footprint using DSS. As you saw with Verizon, just really quickly, really not that big, kind of small still, but AT&T is far further along. Also, I've seen a couple of people do some speed testing throughout YouTube in other parts of the country where they're saying, I'm on 5G DSS way more often than with Verizon. I find myself on LTE more. So arguably that DSS footprint for Verizon is really not that large. They claim 230 million. I don't think it's actually there yet. I think there's still some tweaking and software optimizations going on as we get through 20 today, the last day, and then next year 21. They will make it better, but I think right now Verizon is behind on DSS. Rightfully so. I don't think they're very interested in that technology. They're likely just doing it for the icon. But again, AT&T does have the larger 5G DSS footprint versus Verizon, and they are gaining on the coverage gap daily now. Literally daily, sites are being turned on. AT&T had to meet a quota, towards the end of the year for everyone to hit their bonuses, etc. So they are working day and night to gain the coverage and match Verizon toe for toe and even exceed them in many cases. So now we're going to look at T-Mobile. So T-Mobile, again, by far the smallest network of the big two. So now there's only 3 networks. They used to be far bigger, about 1 million square miles bigger than Sprint, which Sprint no longer exists, but they are behind the competition. As you can see right off the bat, immediately, their claim that they have the largest 5G network is, you could clearly see the crowdsourced data points are backing them up. They are far larger than AT&T or Verizon on 5G rollout. So they're really pushing that with their marketing. But as you can see, even on the East Coast, there's a lot more gaps, a lot more wider spots, a lot more orange. So they're smaller there. And then on the West Coast, the west side of the country, they're also far smaller compared to AT&T and or Verizon. So how did T-Mobile get there to where the coverage is today? How did they get to match the big two, or do they need to match the big two? So as it stands, we know now, after looking up more info, doing more research, T-Mobile is going to touch 50,000 cell sites with 2.5. That likely means their densification was largely centered around suburban and urban markets. That signals to me that in the early days, the 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2010s, T-Mobile largely was a regional player. They had no nationwide coverage, and that's exactly what they claimed, that in 2013 they had 0 LTE coverage. It was all mainly HSPA, and they had no coverage really outside of any city limits. So T-Mobile has been the furthest behind for a very long time now compared to the competition in terms of coverage and square miles of covering the geographical footprint of the country. On POPs, they were decent because they covered the main big cities and smaller towns, but they never had any real coverage. So how did they get there? They expanded. Since 2015, they expanded the network by adding in 15,000 more macro sites. So they now have a total as a standalone of 65,000 sites. So they added 15,000 sites to expand the coverage to what you see here. In 2017, they covered roughly 1.6 million square miles of LTE. That is likely estimated now to be around 1.8 to 1.9 million. And in the next 3 years, this is my prediction, I think they'll be between 2.2 to 2.4 million square miles of LTE covered, which will still put them roughly 300,000 to 400,000 square miles of LTE behind the competition. The competition will likely extend their coverage reach closer to the 3 million square mile mark within that same time frame. I think FirstNet has to cover 99+% of the country anyway, and I think if Verizon wants to compete for the agencies, I think they get closer to that footprint as well. That puts T-Mobile behind again. So how did they even get to covering that additional 2+ million square miles? So for densification, they are going to incorporate 10,000 Sprint Keep sites. That will get their network to 75,000 total sites. How do they get to that total of the 85,000 that the company set out? They are going to build brand new an additional 10,000 cell sites. Now, I was listening in on some videos last night, doing some research, and Mike Sievert said during the Capital Analyst Day that they have in Germany that most, if not all, of those 10,000 sites that they're building new on the macro term are going to be for coverage. So 50,000 cell sites for macro, then you incorporate another 10,000 from Sprint keep sites. That'll bring you up to par on densification, definitely. That's a very dense network at the suburban and urban markets. And then they also plan on rolling out 50,000 small cells. So I think the densification part of it is largely going to be handled very well by them. But the coverage is where they lack. So if they incorporate another 10,000 macros purely for coverage, especially now with the standalone 5G and them having 600 megahertz, they're probably going to push that signal out much further than they would have band 12. So then you can guesstimate that they will get to that coverage. They may even get to 2.5, 2.6 million square miles covered if they push the coverage out, 20, 30 miles on the 600 megahertz. So is that necessarily the best way to cover? No, not really. A lot of sites that AT&T and Verizon are incorporating on coverage have roughly about a 5-6 mile gap to build out coverage that way. T-Mobile may not be able to get there right away because they're so heavily involved in incorporating and integrating the network on a larger scale. But eventually, over time, they can start plugging in some of that densification even on coverage as needed. So again, it's kind of clear cut right now. I still think it's really Verizon, AT&T, and then T-Mobile. I think Verizon and AT&T are going to really duke it out for that first place. I think with FirstNet, I think AT&T wants to be able to claim the top spot in terms of coverage. So I think they do fight for that. But I think, don't sleep on T-Mobile. I think they eventually get there over the next 3 years. By the end of 2023, I think they put a lot of sites in the ground. They have the American Tower deal. They got Crown Castle. They got more money now to back them up. So I think they get there, but it's going to take time, and they're not going to, I don't think they go toe-to-toe with the competition, but they don't really need to. I think they just need to get better at what they do. They're still going to gain people, and if they do get to 2.5, 2.6 million, I think at that point they can already start growing the enterprise business if they compete heavily there for the business customers, the bigger business customer. The small business segment, I think they have that under control pretty well. People are looking for value. Also a great network. I think small business, T-Mobile has that under control. But on the bigger Fortune 500 companies, T-Mobile is really going to have to aggressively fight for them, and they're going to have to present those customers, those business customers, with a great product. So let me know what you think about this. This is the end of year coverage comparison video. Probably a little longer than I anticipated, but I just wanted to really give you guys some pointers and some explanation as to how the carriers got to the coverage the way it is today, and kind of see where they are headed in the future with coverage. So again, if you are new to the channel, or you have been on the channel and you have not yet liked, share, subscribed, make sure you do so. Also hit the notification bell so you are notified when I do upload content. Also follow the social media outlets for more updates and interaction, the Twitter and Instagram. For more interaction, the videos of YouTube are going on Twitter. Videos of speed tests and towers are going on the Instagram, so you guys can follow those and check them out. And thanks again for watching. This is Tyrone with Tech Life, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.